good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to the session today. My name is Lorraine Charles, and I'm the Executive Director of NAMO and Research at Cambridge University, and we're one of the co-hosts for this session. Thank you for joining us today to this really exciting session. And welcome to the Migration Summit. The Migration Summit 2022, organized by MIT Refugee Action Hub, NAMO, Karam Foundation, Paper Airplanes, and the MIT Abdul Jamil Latif World Education Lab, is a month-long global convening designed to build bridges between diverse communities of displaced learners, universities, companies, nonprofits, and NGOs, social enterprises, foundations, philanthropists, researchers, policymakers, and employers, and governments around key challenges and opportunities for refugee and migrant communities. This year, we're exploring the theme of education and workforce development through virtual events hosted by participating partners all over the world. Today, I'm really excited to introduce the session, Collective Action for Youth on the Move, and my two wonderful guests today, Emma and Leila. And I just want to say as a caveat that they hosted a private session a few weeks ago and I was on it. And this was a fantastic session. And I think everyone will really enjoy and really appreciate what Leila and Emma are trying to do. So just to introduce my speakers today, Leila has worked at the intersection of technology and society for over 2 decades. Her work centers on accelerating digital inclusion through responsible innovation and education. As the head of Emerging Technologies Initiative at NetHope, a consortium of 63 global nonprofits, Leila leads strategic efforts focusing on enabling global nonprofits to develop and use technology in a responsible way to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Since 2017, she's led the program at NetHope focused on education in emergencies. Welcome, Leila. Emma is Senior Advisor for Youth Development with Mercy Corps, with over 10 years experience working with displaced youth across Africa and the Middle East. Emma is inspired by the potential of young people and committed to partnering with young people to create a better world for themselves and their communities. And I've sort of known Emma and Leila throughout the years, in different spaces and seen their work. And I think everyone will really enjoy what they present today. Emma and Leila, welcome, and over to you. And everyone, please share in the chat where you're calling from and the organization you're affiliated with, so we know who's in the room with us. Over to you guys.
Thank you, Lorraine, and thank you to the MIT Migration Summit for inviting us to actually join all of you and get your input on something we've been developing over the past 7 months. And as Lorraine mentioned, would love to know who's in this session. So if you can use the chat window to let us know where you're joining from in terms of city or country, and also your affiliation, that would be also helpful as we engage in a discussion a bit later in the session. So just to give you the sense for what the purpose of the session is, and obviously you came here because you read our description, but in a nutshell, what we're trying to do is get your collective expertise and input to refine the collective action framework, and also gather any further resources and ideas to add to the framework. And we'll be obviously giving you the overview of the framework. So in this session, what you can expect to do is, 1, provide suggestions and feedback on the framework, on the first draft of the framework that we'll be sharing with you. We'd love to hear from you your own lessons learned about collective action and the realm of solutions for youth on the move. So that we define as refugees, IDPs, migrants, and vulnerable host community youth. Also, if you know of any great resources, relevant resources like templates, guides, reports, research, and similar, please share those links in the chat window, or you can follow up with us after this session. We'd love to curate also a library of a repository of resources to be shared with this framework. And then do share any ideas you might have on how you could apply this framework in your work. So what we'll do over the next 20-25 minutes is provide an overview of the collective action framework, and then really open it up for discussion, reflection, questions, ideation, and brainstorm with all of you. So this is meant to be quite interactive. In fact, what we hope to use is both the features in Zoom, so all of you can come off mute and ask questions and share ideas. You can use the chat window, but we also have created a Miro board, which I will share in a second, but mainly to give you an opportunity to jot down any thoughts and ideas, share any links, and also to be able to come back. We'll keep this Miro board open for the next 2 weeks, so you're welcome to share it also and discuss this with your colleagues and with your network. So let me just do a quick demo of Miro, and Lorraine and Emma will be sharing with you the direct link to the Miro board. So for those of you who might not have used Miro before, I'll share with you really 3 features that you need to know for active participation here. Can I just confirm that you can see my screen with the Miro board? Yes, I see the nod. So when you come into the Miro board, you'll see the layout that has been designed for this session. And all you need to know is how to really see the full board by clicking Fit to Screen in the lower right-hand corner, and then to be able to zoom out or zoom in. If you zoom in, you'll see that we'll be focusing on 3 key questions, which we'll continue to come back to throughout this discussion. So any feedback and suggestions you might have on different components of the framework, your own lessons learned related to collective action, and then also any ideas you might have in terms of how you could apply this framework in your work. Down below, we've provided some key considerations for you in terms of how you might approach responding to these questions. We won't go into this in detail because this is meant to be a demo, but do note here that we provided some prompts for how to begin responding to these questions from the perspective of your own expertise and your own experience. And now really, like, what you can do to participate, you can either grab one of the post-it notes that are already here, like this yellow one, and begin typing and move it around in the right spot. Let me just delete this. Or you can click, press letter N as Nicholas in your on your keyboard to bring up the sticky note bar and select any color that you'd like to use. So let's say I'll use this color, create a post-it note, share my idea, and then move on and create a new one, again, by clicking on letter N to bring up the sticky note bar. So that's mainly what you really need to know in order to actively share your thoughts and ideas in Miro board. Of course, other modalities are included in the interaction. You can come off mute and use also the chat window. So before I move on to really talking about the framework, just wanted to see if there are any questions about the Miro board and how you might use it during the session or as a follow-up to the session. I can see somebody's already in the Miro board, fantastic. And do use it throughout this session, and we'll have plenty of time also after we present the framework to go into the Miro board and have a discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing the Miro board and go back to the slides. Here we go. So in summary, we're looking for your feedback. We're looking to learn from you, your own lessons from collective action. And we're also looking for your ideas in terms of how you might apply this framework. All right, here's some background on the framework. The first draft of the collective action framework, which we'll be sharing with you today, was developed in 2021, so about 7 months ago as part of the Rewired Sandbox, and it was also presented at the Rewired Summit. For those of you who might not be familiar with the summit was organized by Dubai Cares as part of the Dubai Expo. It convened about 2,000 education stakeholders from over 60 countries. And at the summit, we had the opportunity to share this collective action for youth in the move. It was recognized and received seed funding from Dubai Cares to be socialized with a diverse group of stakeholders finalized and made available to all of you. So what we've been doing over the past couple of months is conducting consultations. We just completed two large workshops with many different organizations represented, where we again gathered feedback, ideas, and resources for the framework. We'll be hosting two youth workshops, virtual workshops in May, and also a workshop in Uganda. One thing that I want to note for those of you who have colleagues or partners in Uganda whose expertise could help refine this framework, do let me know after this session. Would love to invite them and have them included. And then we're targeting to publish the next iteration of the framework and distribute it more broadly in June of 2022. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Emma to take us through the first part of the framework. Emma, over to you.
Thanks, Leila. Great, so let's dive into the framework itself. So starting with the creators. So the collective action framework was developed by NetHope, Mercy Corps, and War Child Holland. Our colleague from War Child Holland is unfortunately not able to make it today, but very much with us in spirit. So between our organizations, we really have decades of experience in working in everything from youth development to education to emergency response. And within that type of programming, hundreds of different kinds of partnerships. But when we looked around, we really couldn't find very much in terms of practical guidance on collaborating among different stakeholders when it comes to youth programming. So this is really what led us to seeing this as a gap and to then developing the collective action framework. So as part of the process of developing the framework, we're working with a huge group of stakeholders to have them contribute to the framework itself. You are part of that today, so that's fantastic. But we're also leveraging global, regional, local expertise and organizations. So this is very much a wider collaborative process beyond our three agencies. Leila mentioned that we were doing youth workshops. So for example, we have a partner who is specialized in youth engagement who'll be leading those youth workshops for us. We have a partner, a youth-led organization we're partnering with in Uganda to lead the stakeholder workshop there. So really, we just want to sort of stress that this is a much wider collaborative process, but also acknowledge the predominance of international global north-based organizations, in this session in particular, and share that this is part of this wider process where we've tried to be very intentional about representation and inclusion. So thanks so much for being part of this process, everyone. So what exactly is the framework itself? So the collective action framework, it's really a multi-stakeholder cross-sector collaboration framework that's focused on developing innovative and sustainable solutions and programs that meet the education-related needs of youth on the move. So the framework really guides coalitions on how to very practically and effectively bring together a very diverse set of stakeholders so they can co-create sustainable solutions and programs, so they can engage in meaningful partnerships with young people and local communities, and so they can innovate responsibly with technology. So while the framework is really developed and targeting the needs of youth on the move, and it will be tested for this population, it's really designed to guide any multi-stakeholder coalition in their collaborative co-creation journeys. So it's really transferable beyond this group. Moving on to who we're really talking about, who are we targeting with this framework? So we're focused here on what we see collectively as a very underserved, very marginalized group, and that is young people. Defined here as being aged 15 to 24, but of course we acknowledge that youth itself is very much a social construct. And so there are a lot of different cultural, social, contextual variables that shape what it means to be a young person. So this is of course very, very flexible according to context. So we know that much of education programming is really very focused on the primary level, and participation in education really decreases for these populations when it comes to early and very much so late secondary levels. But we also know that it's precisely during this stage of a young person's development where this kind of support is really critical, because they're going through these really complex personal, social, physical, emotional changes. And that's really why we're so focused on this marginalized group of young people. And we say youth on the move. What we really mean by that is we're talking about displaced young people, refugee youth, migrant youth, but also marginalized host community youth as well. So that's just to give you an overview a little bit of who we're really talking about. Moving on to the content of the type of programming that we're talking about for this collective action. So we're talking about education-related needs. This is not an exhaustive list, but just a kind of a snapshot of some examples of types of programming. So it could be anything from literacy, numeracy, to social emotional skills and well-being, technical skills, job coaching, for example. So we know that at the onset of a crisis, it's often also the end of schooling. So it's these young people who at that stage are the ones taking on, extra responsibility, adult roles. But it's also precisely during this time of crisis and displacement where education can and should play this critical role in sort of creating this safe and secure environment, right? Where these young people can develop a sense of purpose, develop their identity, a sense of belonging, and really build those livelihood skills and become agents of change. So we believe that young people have the power to shape and influence and develop their communities, but really only if they have the opportunity to shape and influence their own lives. So they really need to be part of the solution from the very beginning and throughout the process. And to do that, we're really founding and basing everything that we do. If we can go back just one second, Leila. We're really founding it all in an approach called positive youth development. So this is a well-evidenced, well-researched approach that really puts young people at the center. It says that their needs are multi-sectoral and that young people should be in the driving seat of their own and their community's development. Great. Moving on to the theory of change for the framework itself. So really, this framework is founded in 4 considerations. So the first is that really sustainable collective action must include strategies across the whole life cycle of a project or program design, not just at the beginning, not just in the middle. And it must foster this culture of co-creation. Secondly, we're saying that effective collaboration must really enable meaningful engagement and leadership of all the stakeholders in the education of youth on the move. And this really is to ensure locally owned, locally led solutions to really locally identified problems. Thirdly is that to really be effective, the solution needs to reflect the complexity of the problem. So the stakeholder expertise, the stakeholder perspectives that we include need to reflect that complexity that I mentioned earlier. Young people's needs are complex, multi-sectoral, etc. And fourthly is monitoring systems and impact assessment really need to be embedded throughout the whole project cycle. This is so that we can really generate data that's going to be useful to all stakeholders in the ecosystem and to enable this continuous learning and iteration that we talked about. So what that means in practice is really that collective action starts with this coalition of stakeholders coming together, coalescing around a common vision for what it is they want to do, being guided by a shared set of principles, and then working together to co-create these solutions, to implement the solutions, and then to learn, iterate, and scale on the impact. Which brings us to the actual theory of change. So it posits that really if stakeholders do have access to relevant and practical guidance for collective action, and if they apply that guidance when they're establishing and implementing these multi-stakeholder partnerships, then it follows that partnerships will be more effective, programs targeting young people will be more impactful, and our end result is enhanced learning outcomes and well-being for young people. Great. Now I will hand back I'll hand back to Leila to introduce us to the process.
Thanks, Emma. So building on what Emma talked about in terms of having this type of guidance, we've designed the collective action framework to guide any type of coalition in how to effectively do three things: bring together this diverse set of stakeholders to co-create solutions and programs, engage in a meaningful partnership with youth and local communities, and also innovate responsibly with technology, given technology's critical role in enabling education and meeting the education-related needs of youth in the move. So in the next slide, what we wanted to share with you, introduce you to actually the three components of the collective action framework. One is the approach to really beginning to identify and map out the key stakeholders centered around specific set of needs of the target audience. In this case, we're talking about youth on the move. Second is the how. How does this group work together? So we put together 6 principles that guide the collective action, or how this group of stakeholders work together. And third, we've structured a 4-component process along with some of the key questions and considerations for each component of the process to guide this kind of process of deliberation and planning. And we'll go to that next in a lot more detail. Before we go into the components of the framework, I do want to encourage you to feel free to post any clarifying questions in the chat window, and also to leverage the Miro board to share the feedback and ideas as they come to you. So with that, I'm handing it over to Emma to talk about key stakeholders.
Super, thanks, Leila. Great, so we're talking about collaboration, but who do we want to see collaborating? So really here, we're talking about anyone who has a stake in the project or program, ideally everyone who has a stake in the program. So this is really a model to be adapted to the context and the program that you're running. So you can see here a number of different stakeholders mentioned. Just to give you an example of what these really mean, let's look at private sector, for example. So this could be local, regional, global level, everything from large established companies to local startups, small enterprises, financial service providers, etc. We also have maybe communities. So here we could be thinking about local facilitators of learning, mentors, parents, maybe peers, or religious or community leaders. So you'll see that there are also a few spaces here for you to insert different types of stakeholders. So really this is to be adjusted to the program and the context that you're focusing on to make sure that all the relevant stakeholders for a specific context, a specific project are really included. It's not just about identifying who those stakeholders are, but really about saying, okay, there's this stakeholder, this is their specific role or the added value or contribution that they're able to make to the project. So there, in the framework itself, there are some more narrative details on these stakeholders. That takes us to the principles. So in bringing these stakeholders together, we want them to work together according to these common collective action principles. So there are 6 that we've identified. And just to go through them pretty quickly, the first one, and first and foremost, really is seeing youth as collaborators. So really treating youth and working with youth as partners across all stages of this collective action process. And where possible, as much as possible, seeing them as process leaders. So really putting them in the driving seat of processes and activities that we're running. Secondly, in our principles is it should be transformative. Collective action should be transformative. So it should be innovative both in terms of the approach and the technology used. It should embrace systemic change. It should aim to challenge the status quo where that's relevant or where that's identified as a need. And it should be, of course, inclusive of marginalized groups. Thirdly is human-centered. So collective action should be equitable. It should put people first, not tech, and should very much be community-oriented. Responsible. So here we're talking about being accountable, safe, building in privacy by design, sustainable solutions, being reusable, and really to have the process be locally driven. The fifth one is collaborative, so committing to co-creation, committing to inclusive processes, and being transparent across all stages of the process. And finally, we have measurable, so basing the solutions on evidence, creating and generating evidence as we move forward, fostering reflection and co-reflection in this case, and really committing to learning and iteration. So really, to ensure that youth thrive requires that all stakeholders do work together to address these young people's needs really holistically, but guided by and committed to this shared set of principles across all the actors. I will hand back to Leila to take us through the process.
Great, thank you, Emma. So to operationalize these principles, again, centered specifically on meeting education-related needs of youth in the move, we propose 4-component process. And again, we're not calling this stages or phases or anything that implies that it happens as a sequence, but we do believe that some of these are iterative, that you can come from implementation and go back to ideation. So the 4 components that we're proposing here start with ideation or coming together to co-create, moving on to developing, that means prototyping, learning, and also iterating based on what we're learning. As Emma mentioned, measuring and collecting insights and iterating is a core component of the collective action process. Then really implementing, delivering and sustaining impact, and then ultimately and ideally growing this impact potentially through scale or taking the solutions and programs to other potentially geographical regions or expanding them to more young people. What we've done with the with this process, or kind of the what, the implementation of the collective action, or how you operationalize the collective action and the coalition, is that we've provided a set of questions that you might want to ask as you start coming together, as you prototype, as you develop, and as you consider scaling. Along with the questions, we've also provided some of the examples from our own lessons learned and our own practical implementations. We plan to curate a set of resources that go into depth on some of the critical topics like gender equality or private sector engagement. And we've also provided a few prompts, just mainly to get the coalitions to begin thinking in a more holistic, systemic, and again, human-centered and youth-centered way. What we're looking for in this conversation also to get your perspective on your own lessons learned and some of the resources that you've found useful that align with the spirit of the collective action framework. So what I'll do next is take you through some of these questions that we're proposing to consider and some of the examples that we're already providing in the first iteration of the framework. So as you go into the idea stage, again, centering on the young people and who you're supporting and understanding their need, understanding the context and in which the need exists. Asking the question around how this need is being met today, if there are primary shortcomings or barriers to success of this approach. So building whatever the new or adapted solution or program is on what already exists. Or the lessons learned from what already exists. What is the proposed solution? How does it address some of these shortcomings? Who are the key stakeholders in this solution based on what is being proposed? Again, what are the resources and expertise that might be needed in order to build or adapt a solution? What does success look like and how will you measure it? So really, to Emma's earlier point, incorporating the practice of measuring and learning at the onset. Also asking the question if the solution can be implemented and sustained, to move away from developing POCs or pilots and not being able to sustain them because of certain circumstances that could include resources or political or policy related barriers. And then what changes to the existing processes or policies might you require in order for this solution to be possible? Again, we've provided these kind of 8 sets of questions to prompt the coalitions to really begin creating a solid foundation and coalescing around what they will be doing together and why this needs to exist vis-a-vis the overall context and also other solutions and programs that might be implemented. So as mentioned, what we've done is, in addition to the questions, what we incorporated is some of the prompts and some of the examples. So example needs, if you are to focus on refugee youth ages 15 through 24, might include literacy and numeracy, especially if young people have been out of school for a longer period of time. Maybe technical and transferable skills that connect them to employment opportunities, employment to or psychosocial well-being. Some of the example context to consider could be lack of connectivity and devices. We might be designing a great technical solution that is not possible to implement without the overall enabling environment that includes connectivity, devices, power, and digital literacy. Some of the other considerations, again, from our own experience, that are important to at least take a look at, if not explore in more depth through research, are learners' motivations, interests, and priorities, learners' accessibility needs, as well as caregivers' engagement. So again, these are meant to be prompts, not completely like exhaustive list of examples, but enough for those that are building a coalition or might be new to coalition building to begin deliberating what will be potentially developed. So similarly, for each question, we're providing some of these prompts. So I'll just touch on a few, as you haven't had a chance to see the framework. Hopefully this will trigger some of your own lessons learned and some of the resources that you found useful in the context of these other questions that we're asking. So when considering some of how these needs are being met today, we also propose to consider all conditions for systems change. That might include local, legal, and regulatory environment. So that could include local employment laws, as we found, and Lorraine and I have talked about that before, as she's working in this space. Really, how the most effective way to connect learning to earning is to think through the whole journey and to understand what the barriers might be at each point, so that to ensure that young people are getting trained in the skills that are actually employable either in the local market or in other ways. And that's where understanding of the policies is critical. Also understanding their local relationships and network, because they could be very beneficial in sustaining the solution, as well as local cultures and practices. I'll move relatively quickly through some of these, but do feel free during the Q&A to ask for additional clarifications. So when really defining what the solution might be, what we propose is really to consider not just, let's say, a technical solution or technology solution as a standalone, but the overall wraparound or enabling environment that might be required to effectively deploy and benefit from that solution. So that could include content for, let's say, some apps or software, teachers and teacher training, as well as some of the tools like, again, devices, connectivity, and power. The one other thing that, again, based on our learning, that especially when dealing with our technology and innovating responsibly with technology, that we encourage is to really consider whether a net new solution needs to be developed, or it's something that could be procured or adapted based on the existing solutions that are already out there, whether it's localization in terms of language, adaptation of certain features, connecting the currently disconnected or fragmented solution into a more holistic solution for the young people, but really just asking the question of whether we need yet another, let's say, app. We've already talked about some of the stakeholders. We've provided examples of the stakeholders to consider, just again, based on our own practical implementations when centering on the needs of the youth on the move. So also this building on some of the work that we've done with the private sector, when considering the resources and expertise that your solution might need, it's really also important to consider what the different stakeholders can bring to the table. What are their unique strengths, and also what are the resources that are already available to them. So in the case of, for example, private sector, that might include funding, but also technical expertise, the technology expertise, as well as product, or either off-the-shelf product that could be just immediately deployed, or adaptation of existing product, or even advocacy or support for specific policy in the local market. I'm going to move through this very quickly. One of the questions that that is critical to really consider in the ideation stage and beyond the pilot is, can this proposed solution be implemented and sustained, and what might be required for that, especially as we consider youth on the move and not always being in the same location and potentially needing to continue learning as they move to the next location, and also considering the resources that might be required beyond the initial pilot and iteration stage, and securing them early enough so there's no disruption in providing the benefits of your solution. So as we go into the develop, we propose to ask really three sets of questions. One is really, what is your coalition's approach to co-creating the solution together based on what the solution is, and also who the key stakeholders are? What needs to be included in the prototype to understand really if this is the right fit for the young people, for the context, and for the needs, as well as really having an approach to validate if you are on the right track, and then being able to iterate or pivot if needed, if the solution doesn't meet the needs. So similarly to the ideate stage, we provide few prompts, examples from our own experience. Would love to hear from you what some of your lessons learned are in terms of how do you co-create as a coalition, as a collective of partners working together. One thing that we've included here for different coalitions to potentially implement is having two interconnected teams. A team that is responsible for the implementation of the plan, and maybe a board of key stakeholders that are responsible for guiding the project, mobilizing the necessary resources, and also reporting to the donors. So again, this is just based on our own experience and talking to our partners. I'm going to be clicking here. So what is your approach to validating if you're on the track? So keeping in mind some of the principles that Emma mentioned at the beginning, including youth as partners, it is very important to consider youth in your methodology for measuring and learning. So what is your methodology for getting feedback from the youth on the move that are youth friendly and not threatening? So again, throughout the framework, we're trying to emphasize how do you actually operationalize some of these principles and put the right plans and processes in place. In terms of the implementation, again, we keep coming back to resources and expertise, because oftentimes that is the barrier to continuing the work and to deliver and to iterating and also continuing to deliver an effective solution. We continue to come back monitoring and learning. So even after you've developed, iterated on your pilot, learned a lot, you need to continue monitoring and learning and adapting. Also capturing the lessons learned from the solutions, both internally from the coalition and also externally from the different stakeholders. And if needed, having a plan in place to retire or decommission solution in case the context, the situation, the need changes. So it could be the change in policy, you're no longer able to implement. It could be that the need no longer exists, or it could be that you were not able to secure the required resources and expertise to implement the solution in a safe and responsible way. So again, you're seeing here some of the prompts that we've included and examples from our collective work. One of the things, again, from that we included as it relates to capturing and sharing lessons learned from the solution is ensuring that when using digital and including audiovisual technology, to consider enabling youth to capture their own learning and have a process for communicating those learnings to other key stakeholders. So again, keeping that youth as partners and human centricity at every step of the process. And then the fourth component that we're recommending to include in your collective action is scaling or growing impact. And that might include asking the question of how your the suitability of your solution for the different need and the new context could be a new market, new language. What resources and expertise might be considered, what changes to the existing solution or the implementation approach might be required because the context is different, whether it's culture or infrastructure, and also who might be the key stakeholders in the scaling of the solution. It could be a different group from those that were developing the pilot or implementing the solution in the original context. So just moving through some of this to get to make sure that we have enough time for really a brainstorm with you, to get your feedback, to hear your lessons learned, and to also just get your ending ideas you might have for how you would begin to leverage this type of framework. Emma, you've been probably paying attention to the Miro board and the chat window, so I'm going to hand it over to you to kick off the brainstorm.
Great, thanks, Leila. Yeah, we'll kick off, we'll open the floor in a second. I just wanted to address two questions that were in the chat. One is from Demiana, who was talking about how your organization, Demiana, People of Impact, does some similar work. So it would be fantastic to hear about some of your experiences, and maybe you could share some of the resources that you use in this work. That would be really helpful. And Rezene from Ethiopia, I think, asked a really great question. So when it comes to refugees identifying needs, the question was, what about those who are not able to identify needs? So I would answer that from my experience of working particularly with young people. I would say that it's pretty much always the case that people are able to express their needs. I think what's not always consistent, and what usually is the problem, is our ability to actually meet them where they are and bring out those thoughts from them. So this is really about accountability to affected populations. And for example, in the case of young people, that really means understanding who they are, understanding their life experience, building relationships of trust with them. So it's really not a case of just going in and saying, tell me about your needs, we're going to create this project. It's a much longer process of engaging at the local level and building those relationships so that young people and communities are in a place where they're able to share what it is they think. Often this also for us means that there's a lot of information they need in order to be able to really participate. So for example, we often have to kind of explain how the humanitarian grant system works to really, put young people in a space where they're able to talk about that, critique it, talk about what they think should happen within it or what kind of projects should happen within it. So I would say this comes back to our principle of youth as collaborators and talking about things being locally led. It's definitely a much longer process of, first of all, understanding those communities, having trust and building relationships with them in advance of them actually becoming a stakeholder. So I hope that answers that question.
Emma, if I may, I think this is a super important question. It just goes back to how do you really effectively shift from single actor or multiple actors where youth are consulted but not necessarily incorporated as partners and co-creators in a process to what we're proposing here with just two observations on your point around meeting youth where they are. So as a former teacher of refugees and a former refugee myself, One thing that I found incredibly important is to use non-threatening methodologies and to really think about making a whole set of different methodologies available for them to express themselves. And that might not mean hosting a workshop like this. This is why Emma mentioned that our workshop with the youth will look completely different from what we're doing here, in order to really meet them where they are and really start with their own experiences rather than with what we are proposing. The second thing that is important that also came up in a discussion that we had today is leveling the playing field for the young people by giving them the information so they can make informed recommendations and decisions. And that depends on the solution, that depends on where they are in terms of their knowledge or trauma or language in order to be able to effectively participate. So all of that needs to be considered for that seat at the table to be really, truly effective and meaningful and empowering for the young people.
Great, thanks, Leila. Great, so with that, I'll bring you back to the 3 questions on the slide. Thank you, Lorraine, you just posted the Miro link again. I see lots of people in the Miro board, so please feel free to put your reflections under the 3 questions. Also, I'd just like to open the floor, would you like to reflect on one of these 3 questions? Perhaps, in particular, we'd love to hear about your experiences of working in collaboration with different partners and stakeholders. So anything that you found works really well or anything that's particularly challenging. So yeah, I'll open the floor and feel free to pitch in. In the meantime, as you're sort of cooking up your contributions, I'm just having a look at the Miro board to see, some of the interesting comments there. So some of the questions we have. Would like to learn more.
Should I go to the Miro board?
Yeah, shall we share it?
Yep, that's super easy. So let me just do that. And then if you can direct me to where you are, where you're looking.
Great. So this green one on the top right of the first question, would like to learn more about how you support the human-centered people processes, compassionate systems framework. I'm not sure if the person who wrote this would like to tell us a little bit more about compassionate systems framework. Would be super intrigued. So yeah, I think that's you, Lana, over to you.
Yeah, happy to. So I really, love the emphasis that you have here on human-centered, really engaging with all the stakeholders within the system. But I think, and I guess I'd be curious to learn more about what that looks like for you, because I find sometimes we can start with sort of knowing the who and having everybody at the table, but then there's the how around that who. So how are we in relationship with one another, particularly within a sector like education, humanitarian response, where people can become, incredibly burnt out. Relationships can be strained because of resource scarcity. And so I've been working with an organization both here at MIT and then in an independent nonprofit called the Center for Systems Awareness on this compassionate systems framework that they've been working with in education, really kind of globally, but a lot of work centered in California here in the US and British Columbia within Canada around how do you enact major systems change processes in education, and a lot of that starts with how do we understand ourselves, how do we understand each other in relationship and tend to those relationships in the midst of complex collective action and system change processes. So I would love to learn more about in that human-centered approach, how do we attend to the sort of emotions and experiences, lived experiences of the people who are within those systems?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say, and maybe Leila, you can complement, first of all, that we'll definitely have a repository of resources linked to all elements of the framework. So resources like this would be fantastic if you could share. I think we shared we will again share the email to share resources so that we can make sure we're including links to anything else that might be relevant. I would also say that, you know, there is a limit to what the collective action framework can do. So similar to what the answer to Rezene's question, I think there's, you know, we're talking about bringing stakeholders together, but there's a lot about what needs to happen before that stage even occurs, right? Like these relationships that need to exist with local, particularly with, I would say, local communities, local systems and structures, local ministries of education, maybe ministries of youth, and young people themselves. And I think if that good relationship doesn't pre-exist coming into a process like this of trying to bring all these stakeholders together, then there's not going to be so much success in this process. And for sure, we will be linking to a lot of resources that talk about how to do that. So for example, a partner that we work with a lot in Mercy Corps is EDEO, they work a lot on human-centered design processes. We have an awful lot of resources on how to really meaningfully engage young people. And it's a very elaborate process in itself that needs to happen in advance of this happening. And so they will all be linked to the framework itself so that we're not recreating the wheel, but rather really curating and picking out the best resources in order to get to this point that we're kind of putting forward in the framework. Leila, anything you'd add to that?
The only thing as mentioned as we were going through the components of the process is what we've tried to do is in these prompts and examples to just bring back to youth at the center and human centricity as much as possible so that those who are really thinking about the solutions and operational elements don't lose sight of the humans and also their changing needs and where they are and how that changes over time. So I think as you take a look at the framework, and we'll share with you the link to the draft, would love to get any additional examples that you think are important to emphasize in order to bring back attention to those 6 principles that we shared with you, human centricity being one of them. And also, thank you very much for adding the link. That's exactly what we're hoping for. So those of you who have these resources that could be added to our repository, please just add them in the Miro board. We'd love to see more of those. Emma, where would you like to go next on the board?
Maybe over to the middle here. So we have sustainability of solution, and tech maintenance and updates. Would love to hear what this is about. So I'm wondering who wrote this. Would you like to just explain a little bit more what you mean?
Sorry, that was me again. So I was particularly drawn to the question where it said ed tech solutions. So some things that we've seen in the ed tech space is, you know, there's the initial, let's say, app creation or a tool created, a website, and then just how is it maintained over time. So you know, as the years go by, they become no longer functional, and so often there's, you know, or sometimes there's the initial excitement about the creation, and then these projects get kind of abandoned. And so, to the point of reinventing the wheel, are there things that exist that are maybe just we need to wipe the dust off a bit and update them and support others in updating some of these existing solutions, modernizing them, rather than starting over from scratch again.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I think that's an interesting comment, and we'll reflect on that in the context of some of our principles, perhaps, where we have sustainability as well. So yeah, great comment.
If I may add one other thing, just that this has prompted, and something that we've been practicing at NetHope, especially with some of the newer technologies, for example, chatbots being deployed during the crisis, is really urging everyone to think about reusability and templatization and sharing and open sourcing what exists. So just to give you an example, we developed 2 chatbots specifically with a number of our members, global NGOs in Africa, in collaboration with technical experts from Microsoft, with the goal to make those templates now available to anybody else. They're posted on NetHope Solution Center, where anyone, along with a how-to document, can download those templates and have a starting point that's not ground zero, but actually very well advanced in terms of then just needing to localize and plug in their content. So looking at what already exists, but also as you develop new things, we want to encourage reusability and templatization.
Super. Staying with the same question, I like this comment in pink at the top. Accompaniment and follow-up are the best way to stay tuned. I think that really fits nicely with sort of our idea of collective action being across the whole cycle. So wondering if the author of this note could tell us a little bit more about their experience maybe in this. You know, have you seen this in some of your partnerships or your programs? Can you tell us a little more? Or generally also opening the floor if anyone wants to talk a little bit about their experiences in partnering. I'm sure many of you have had experiences in working with at least one partner. So would love to hear about how that has gone.
And just as a reminder, while we are recording this, this is off the record and won't be shared publicly. If you'd like to share some of these lessons learned of working with partners, and you don't have to mention names, of course.
Yeah. But generally very much agree with this comment that it's really about accompanying and follow up. And this is really what the framework is trying to get at. It's trying to say that we're not just, it's not just a one-off consultation or collaboration, but it's really following up all the way through the process and making sure that everyone stays engaged throughout that process. Great.
Maybe I can interject. Prior to this session, there was a session about refugees accessing higher education, and one of the comments made, I'm not sure if Melissa is here, but she spoke about how no one can tackle this problem on their own, and she talks about how different organizations partner for students to get access to university places. People support with mentoring, some support with English language development, and in a way creating a network of organizations working toward getting refugee students access to university places. And for me, that was a really great example of, I think, what you're trying to do: stakeholder organizations working together to support one common goal.
Yeah, that's a great example. And just to share an example from my experience as well, I worked for a long time in Jordan where we ran youth programs. And as an NGO, it was very difficult to meet the needs of young people because what they wanted was beyond our scope. So they wanted, IT programs that were certified. We couldn't do that. We had to partner with different institutions. They wanted exactly higher education, access to university. We had to partner with universities. And so we ended up with about 10 to 12 different partners just within one program. And so I think it's particularly the case when working with young people, because they don't all follow the same pathway, right? They all have different needs and ambitions. And in most cases, I would say youth programs need to have or will have some kind of partner on board. So I think that's why it's also particularly relevant for this group. Great. Anyone else have any experiences to share? Okay, so maybe looking over at how we might apply it to our work. We could apply and share the framework tools and how to use it for several NGOs. That sounds great. Leila, would you like to talk a little bit to sort of our dissemination plan and next steps? You alluded to it a little bit in the presentation.
Yes, absolutely. And would love to get your feedback on that, obviously, and make sure that this community gets reached with the next iteration of the framework. So as mentioned, as we will be doing additional consultations, continue to gather feedback, ideas, and resources. and then reflect on just the kind of collective input and determine what will go into the next iteration of the framework. Would like to make the framework available by the end of June, so the next iteration from what you've seen today. And we'll do that through the channels that reach about 12,000 in our community, NetHope community. And obviously, we'll partner with Lori and the team here at MIT Migration Summit to make sure that those of you who joined us today also get access to the framework and the repository of resources. But that said, we look at this also as an iterative process. So as you begin doing what you're saying here, applying it and sharing it, would love for you to continue building on it and adding resources and some of the case studies, because ultimately where the value will also come from is having the case studies of this collective action being implemented with multiple stakeholders being involved, and then having these solutions being sustained, not only deployed, but also sustained, as mentioned earlier, and what can we learn from that? So that is to say, we'll make it available broadly, but we also hope through these consultations to gather a community of practitioners that will continue learning together with us and building on it.
Great. Great. If we can go back to question 1, Leila, there's another interesting comment at the bottom of question 1, this green post-it. So sharing impact reports with refugee settlements to attract and inspire more youth students in these programs. I think this also gets at what the collective action framework is trying to do, right? Because not only is it about, it's really about young people leading the way. And a practical example of that happens in some of our programs, for example, is having young people form a research team, for example, to lead the monitoring and evaluation that happens in a program. This could be an example of putting youth in the driving seat within your co-creation process or your collective action process. So not only sharing back, monitoring data and success stories, but also saying, will you actually lead the process in what you think is most important to be collecting in terms of data, what you think is most important to be sharing back, and allowing the young people to actually lead that entire process. So that's an example of how you can really follow one of our principles in the framework throughout the collective action process.
I have a question actually for Leila and Emma. So I think we're very fortunate to have so many refugee speakers in this room today. And I wonder if you could pose any question to them, what would you ask them? Because the ones we have here are, MIT React alumni and others, and bright and really engaged refugee learners. What would you want to know from them? And I really let you, I hope I aren't pushing you guys on the spot, but I really, would love to hear what you would like to hear from them about what you've presented today.
It's a great question. So what I would want to ask is, how would you like to be approached about solutions? So how would you like to be approached, first of all, and how would you like to be engaged in the process of thinking about a solution or implementing a project? Leila, I wonder if you have other questions.
Just building on that, what we talk about partnering youth as partners, youth as co-creators, what does that mean to you? What is it and what is it not? And maybe sharing even just some of the examples of how you might be engaged today that doesn't represent this youth, you being a co-creator and partner. So that's just help us build that story through kind of your experience and your voice and what you envision. And then the second part of that question, as discussed earlier, is what do you need to feel empowered and prepared to be a partner and co-creator, especially in a group of some of the stakeholders that Emma shared on one of the slides.
So feel free to jump in on that, but just to address some of the comments, great comments that are coming up. Juan Federico is talking about, we need to feel like someone cares. I think that's really critical, and it goes back to what I was talking about before about there's an entire process of building relationships with these stakeholders, particularly the young people in the communities, that needs to precede a lot of this collective action work, right? If those foundational relationships are not in place, it just won't work. And I think it is much more complex than we give it credit for. And it really does take a lot of time and investment to make it meaningful. Rezene is saying there should be flexibility on the age. Some refugees may have lost 10 years of their childhood for being a refugee. Absolutely, Rezene, I totally agree. I think the categorization of 15 to 24 is really used for statistical purposes more, so that we can really pull out some data that says, there are this many young people, or, these are the needs among this age group. But it's totally true that this concept of waithood exists for many refugees, right? Where they've not been able to follow on their life path, and their trajectory was interrupted. And so they're waiting for a lot of these opportunities to, and for the policies to change, and for things to change in their life so they can continue. So I totally agree. And that concept of what it means to be a young person really needs to be defined very locally. And sometimes it's not even at a national level. It's defining it at a community level, because different populations within different countries can have a totally different experience and a totally different meaning of what it is to become an adult, or to exit childhood, for example.
I love this
Great.
comment from Blaine too. Blaine, you're raising one of the important points that we've tried to highlight in the questions and prompts for the stakeholder, for the coalition to think through, is how to address host country policies around refugee employment, because connecting learning to earning is an important goal for many of the young people that Emma and I have worked with. And then also having access to higher education and really just active participation in the society. So in addition to making that top of mind for the coalition through this framework, one of the things that we hope to do through the repository of resources is talk about the different roles that different stakeholders can play. So for example, private sector, as mentioned earlier in the example, could actually advocate on behalf of the coalition for certain policies that would enable a more effective, more holistic implementation of the solution. So that could include employment participation. So yes, that we're trying to make sure, if you recall that slide that Emma shared with the education-related needs, to connect the dots for those needs, from literacy and numeracy to learning skills to receiving psychosocial support, all the way to accessing employment, and ensuring that the coalition is really thinking through not only what might be possible, but what barriers need to be removed along the way.
Yeah, and I would just complement that with, part of the stakeholder engagement here is also, it's not running programs kind of in isolation from existing structures. It's really also trying to bring in stakeholders who are part of existing systems, like ministries, authorities. And partly in that way, it might not be the only approach, but partly in that way, we're already bringing in decision makers, right? We're already engaging with the people who maybe have the power to change things, and connecting them a bit more directly with the people who need that change. And I often see that as really a huge gap. The other thing that I would take from Blaine's comment is maybe there is a bit more of a role for advocacy, right, to be built into this framework. So that's a really nice one for us to reflect on. Great. So keep the comments flowing in the chat. Feel free to jump off mute if you would like to. I'm going to pick a different color now. Shall we go with blue? Maybe back to question 1. There's a blue comment. Give insight on the open world education system, availability of many kinds of courses. Great. I think, Leila, you're well placed to answer this one. So the availability of courses, kind of open source courses, I think.
I would love to hear actually from the person that posted this, just to elaborate on what kind of what they see today and with what they would like to see in the future if the collective action framework would, the collective action framework could enable. So if you can see on the screen, it's this blue post-it note.
Yeah, like it's mine. Like, let me give you an idea about it. Like for some refugees, like when they learn or on their home countries, they got their own limits. Like for instance, they can finish up to chemistry level 1 or level 3. When they go outside and become a refugee in other countries, they don't know that that's the limit they know. Like if you need to give them some introduction, telling them that chemistry have like 6 levels, 7 levels, more and more. So you should give them some insights about the open world. That's my idea.
Yeah, I love this idea of open world. It's related to, I mean, you're spot on in terms of one of the biggest challenges that I've found in my work with the young people who've been displaced is that a lot of there's an abundance of knowledge and information out there, but it is just not visible and accessible to them. They just don't know that this exists. So one thing that I'm taking away from this is just emphasizing to ensure that we're making this information easily available and accessible to the young people and helping them connect to that. So, and connect to that could mean actually having access to some of these courses, having access in their own language, free of charge, and with certification, proof of learning that they can actually use to get a job. It's related to a program I was working on actually in the Middle East. So thank you for highlighting that, Rosanna. It's very important.
Yeah, and I would just complement that with, in my experience, it's also really important to think about these solutions at the local level, right? And to prioritize what is available locally. If there's not much, what can be developed in partnership with local organizations, local education partners and institutions. And only when you don't find it locally, or there isn't the capacity or the systems locally to create it, to then think about what international solutions can we bring in, really, so we can create this system or space where young people can engage and express themselves in their own language, but also connecting that with the outside world. Blaine, I see you have your hand up. The floor is yours.
Yeah, okay, all right. Thank you for an incredible session. I would love just to add one point, like for most refugees that, relocate to either Europe or others, developed countries, what you would see is that before joining the workforce or even higher education, they more or less have take language courses in their host countries, which you don't mostly see in other third world countries such as Africa. So what happens in those communities is that because they are living collectively, they would only speak their own languages. So they wouldn't necessarily know the host country language. So maybe we can educate them, give them some courses, but after a while, what will happen is when they try to join the workforce, they don't know the language. And of course, people cannot work with people that can't communicate within their own language. And most host countries prefer their own languages. Even if we take the international language such as Arabic or even English, at the end of the day, they prefer their local language. So maybe we could integrate it in the framework where those refugees communities can learn the host country languages so that they are better prepared for the workforce and also educational opportunities that they may have. Okay, all right, thank you.
That's a great point, Blaine. There's so much research about showing how learning is so much more effective in a person's mother tongue. Yeah, I really like that. And also, the need for not just a program, but what is the entry point for young people into a program or a solution? And if the entry point is, we first need to prepare people with the right language to be able to participate, then that needs to become part of the solution. So yeah, I totally agree with that. I see some other people agreeing in the chat as well. Super.
I just want to echo this. I was English language teacher in a refugee camp, actually preparing those that were resettling to Canada and the UK and the US, both in the school and then also after school program. And just with that specific goal in mind, to be able to integrate into the society and kind of hit the ground running, go to school, get a job. So thanks for emphasizing the importance of language.
Yeah, maybe if I can jump off that, Leila, thanks for saying that about English language, because we forget how important English language is. So while, as Blaine says, it's great to have the local language of your host community, we also have to recognize that English is very important. And in a way, English is sort of one of these commodities which are needed for economic advancement, even in countries where English isn't the first language. And later on in the session, in the summit, we have a session on, about English language being a commodity, and about how, questioning whether it's a good thing that it's so commodified and leading to economic advancement. So, stay tuned to that later in the session, but it is really important to recognize the advantage that we have when we do speak English.
And just to link this also to the framework, I mean, when I was in Jordan, we partnered with a university, and this university wanted to come in and provide university courses, like technical courses for young people. But of course, all the technical courses were in English. And we sat down with the young people, and what they told us is, no, we want English, but we don't just want English, we want certified English that will then give us access to these more academic levels of studying in English, because we realize that online opportunities are predominantly in English at that level. And so the university went back and totally revamped the idea of what they wanted to do and created a certified English course that would actually give these young people certification and proof, where they could then apply for scholarships or apply for university level courses. So a really good example, I think, of a solid partnership where we really listened to the young people and were driven by what it is they told us they wanted to do. So experiences like this are also part of our motivation for trying to make sure that there's a more systematic approach to doing this in the future. Great.
We have about 10 minutes left. Maybe just a question for those of you who haven't had a chance to speak up. If you could share what this discussion has maybe prompted for you. It could be related to the questions that we have on the board here, or it could be something else that you wanted to share, but would love to hear from a few additional participants if you haven't had a chance to speak. If you feel comfortable, you don't have to come on video. You're also welcome to post in the chat window. We'll give you a moment. In the meantime, Emma, anything else on the board that you'd like to quickly spotlight?
Yeah, I like this yellow note on question 1. So what structures or protocols are available for resumption of solutions in volatile areas affected by conflicts? I think this is really interesting, because we're talking here about the different stages of an emergency, and what we can do at each stage is, of course, very different. I would say that partnership is possible and partnership is positive across all stages. So, for example, we see what's happening in Ukraine right now. Mercy Corps, for example, is working in a lot of the neighboring countries, and those countries have very solid structures of local organizations, etc. So partnership is something that just comes as part of our first response, as part of our emergency response. Rather than setting up new structures, it's partnering with these local organizations who have maybe some infrastructure, the operations, the relationships with the communities. There's no need for us to start from scratch. So I'd say that's a good example where the framework could be potentially implemented. Similarly, when you get to protracted crises or development situations, you really want to be thinking about partnership also from a sustainability perspective, right? So that you're not creating parallel structures. But I do think in emergency that partnership should be a consideration, that initial mapping of what already exists, who's already out there? Do we actually need to be starting something new, or can we work through or in partnership with someone who's already on the ground? Should definitely be an initial consideration. Anything you'd add to that, Leila?
No, really well said. It's just really focusing on localizing the work and empowering local stakeholders.
Maybe if we move to the second one, this idea of the availability of resources online jumps out at
Emma,
me.
maybe,
Sorry,
maybe before you go. Yeah.
Lana, over to you. You're on mute, Lana. If you could unmute.
A quick follow-up question on mapping, because I feel like that just keeps coming up for us as a theme throughout the summit, that need to have a sense of the ecosystem, those parallel, structures or resources that exist. What is your either advice for good how to best map that kind of ecosystem? Organizations that have led some of that work, like where it already exists, because I think that's sometimes a challenge is, you don't know what you don't know. And so how do we find a better sense of what does exist in the system?
Yeah, it's a great question. It came up in some of our other consultations that we had in recent weeks. So I would say it comes back to also the question of what work needs to happen before this kind of coalition or collaboration of stakeholders comes into play. So you really need a situation, I think, where you already really know the context, you already really know and have a relationship with the young people and the community and the different stakeholders. If you have that kind of situation, I feel like you'll already have a pretty good sense of who's who in this space. And I think that really needs to be the case in order to have a successful stakeholder collaboration like this. In saying that practically, how do you do it? We have been considering adding a tool to the kit, to the framework that really looks at, well, how do you actually do this mapping? What is the exact information about each stakeholder that you need to gather? And this includes everything from, maybe the role that they could potentially play in the program, the role that they would like to play and their motivation to be part of the program, etc. So that's something that we're considering, and it's a recommendation that came up actually from one of the consultations. Great. There was a note in the second question, this orange one at the top, Leila. The availability of resources offline, and this jumps out because this has been something I've been trying to figure out for many years. So a lot of the context that we're working in, a lot of the young people that we want to be reaching are really not able to engage with a lot of the processes that are online or that require connectivity. And this is part of, one of our principles talks about putting people before tech, right? And meeting people where they are. So I think, first of all, it's really about, I mentioned that our other consultations will focus on young people. For example, those consultations will be low tech. They will not use the Miro board. They'll really be adapted to the fact that many young people just cannot engage with that level of technology. But this idea of making resources available offline is kind of a call really to all education actors, all stakeholders, to really be creating solutions that are going to reach the most marginalized. And that really means sometimes no tech, sometimes very low tech solutions. And I haven't seen so many. I've seen a few interesting solutions in this realm, but not so much when it comes to, really youth-focused programming, or university level type programming. It would be great to see more of that. So it's a point that we're continuously advocating on. But for us, it comes into the framework in the sense that we're really looking for meeting people where they are and making sure that tech does not override everything. And it's part of the solution where it's relevant.
And if I may just complement that, in parallel, in addition to meeting young people where they are, so which could be no tech or low tech solution, low tech could mean just download the content and consume it without the need for connectivity. In parallel with this framework that was developed, we were also working with another coalition that was led by UNESCO and Dubai Cares, focused on connectivity, universal connectivity for education, with the goal to really provide meaningful connectivity to all young people and also facilitators of learning. So that's teachers. So it's a combination of both, making sure that the young people in their communities are not continuously falling behind in access to some of this core infrastructure, that's connectivity, which ultimately opens up doors to education and jobs and the broader community, while making sure that there's no loss of learning by providing a lower tech or no tech solutions. So we need to do both.
Great. We just have a couple of minutes left. I see a couple more suggestions in the chat. That's really great. So we've noted those, Lana and Dimiana, and would be great if you could send us any resources you have in this regard. And also, I think Dimiana will be reaching out to you because you mentioned some experience of working in these kinds of partnerships and approaches, to learn a little bit more about your experience and see what kind of resources we might be able to share. Great. In the last couple of minutes, I just wanted to see, Leila, if you have any final words, and Lorraine.
No, just a big thank you to all of you for asking really insightful questions and providing excellent suggestions and ideas and also amplifying certain themes that we've heard throughout our consultations. It's been particularly a nice surprise to hear from so many of the young people, because this is actually the first consultation that we're doing in the last a month or so, where we have the opportunity to hear from all of you, and really appreciate your feedback. We will, again, want to make sure to share the next iteration with all of you, and also to continue to stay in contact. Emma, over to you for any final thoughts, and then Lorraine to close us off.
Great. Yeah, so I echo what Leila says. Thank you so much. We will follow up and have taken note of all of these comments and suggestions and everything that's in the Miro board. I just wanted to mention, I saw at the beginning, I think we had a participant from Uganda. If you or someone that you know someone who you think might be interested would like to be a part of our in-person workshop in Uganda, please do reach out. I think we had the email up in the presentation, but maybe we can just jot it in the chat here again. Please do reach out, and you're more than welcome to join us. And yeah, thank you so much. Over to you, Lorraine.
I just want to say thank you so much for this. And I think the sort of spirit of this is what I've been saying all along. We need collaboration. This space cannot work unless we all work together. And I think what you've created here is the start of a fantastic mechanism to bring everyone in the space together. And this is much, much needed. So thank you for leading the way on collaboration within this space. And audience, thank you so much, especially the sort of refugee youth, because you are the ones we want to hear from. And I actually sent a message to Leila to say to her, you have in the audience the people that you want to target. So thank you all for being here, because you are the ones who are central to the work that Leila is doing, that Emma is doing, that we're all doing. So thank you all for being here. And please, all of you, we have many fantastic sessions coming up. Please register and come to our other sessions. And please, Leila and Emma, please come to our other sessions as well. Thank you both so very much.